This program Liz O'Hara approached me a few months ago, or maybe even 6 months ago, about doing this program here at the Senior Center. She's involved with the Moms Demand Action group. Is that the correct title?
Moms Demand Action for Gun Sense in America, Johnson County.
Yes, and we're really happy to be a part of this discussion. There's, of course, everything's in the news today about, what we should do to solve these problems. And I hope that having these discussions will help us empower each other to talk to people who can make some of these changes as they are appropriate. So I really do appreciate Liz and getting this program together and working with other colleagues to do that, the 4-week series here. So Liz will be speaking today, but we also have Tricia. And before this meeting, I should have asked if I'm going to say your name right. Is it Zebrowski?
Zebrowski, correct.
Yeah. All right. Well, Tricia is retired from the University of Iowa in 2018, where for 30 years she served on the faculty in the Department of Communication Sciences and Disorders. She's currently the survivor lead for the Johnson County chapter of Moms Demand Action for Gun Sense in America. In this role, Tricia seeks to connect with survivors of gun violence in our community and share the many resources that the Mom Survivor Network has to offer. So I welcome you both to present today, and I thank you all here for coming and joining this conversation. And I'll go ahead and turn it over to Tricia and Liz.
Okay, thanks. Good morning, everybody. And again, thank you for participating in this series of discussions on gun violence in America. The topic is a difficult one, especially this morning when we're full of grief for the people of Uvalde, Texas, and even as we're trying to absorb the gun deaths in Buffalo. Many Americans this morning are asking, what can we do? And a place to start is searching for accurate information on this horrendous problem that we have in the country. And we hope that you come away from these conversations with some helpful insights into the nature of gun violence, and that you form some constructive ideas about what can be done about it at the federal, state, and even here at the local community level. As Michelle said, my name is Liz O'Hara. I'm a major fan of the Center and its programs, the wonderful staff there keep putting together. And we want to thank Michelle Duman for all her help in making this discussion series possible. Since this is a controversial issue, it's important that you know how this class came to be. Full disclosure, as Michelle said, the idea originated with volunteers from the Johnson County Moms Demand Action for Gun Sense in America. The 3 people working on this project, besides myself, are Lenore Holte and Tricia Zebrowski. We're all university retirees. Moms Demand Action for Gun Sense is a nonprofit grassroots organization that's affiliated with Everytown for Gun Safety. It has chapters in every state and 8 million supporters nationwide. It was started by Shannon Watts, mother of 5 kids, after the Sandy Hook school shooting in 2012. Moms Demand Action works to create a culture of responsible gun ownership, promoting gun sense legislation, and educating communities about gun safety. For example, you may have heard of our Be Smart program on safe storage of firearms. Many moms volunteers are gun owners. Many are veterans. It's not our goal to take away people's guns. It's not on our agenda to eliminate the Second Amendment. We don't even like the term gun control. This discussion series is not about Moms Demand Action, and our purpose is not to promote the Moms Demand Action policy platform. It's to provide objective, verifiable information on the nature and scope of the gun violence crisis in this country. We're going to talk about the demographic disparities, important trends we're seeing, and the impact of federal and state legislation, as well as judicial decisions on gun safety. And that's going to include what's happening in Iowa. We do plan to offer the opportunity to discuss what the former New York Times op-ed writer Nicholas Kristof calls a public health approach to the gun violence crisis. And once we've taken the crisis apart and looked at the various pieces of it, we can construct step by step a possible public health policy agenda that could substantially reduce gun violence in this country. So our goal for this class is that all of you, regardless of how you come down politically, end up feeling better informed about what we're dealing with and able to engage in meaningful conversations about what ought to be done. So there's an outline of the 4 sessions in the center's program catalog, but I'll just quickly recap. Today's session will be moderated by Tricia Zebrowski. By the end of the session, you'll have heard a lot about what gun violence looks like in this country, who's affected and how, the public costs, et cetera. Some of the facts that we'll be talking about today may surprise you, and it's essential to know these facts in order to develop ways to reduce the violence. Next week, on June 1st, Wednesday, Todd Pettis of the UI Law School will talk about the Second Amendment and how understanding of this provision in the US Constitution has evolved since the Founding Fathers put it to paper. You may have heard Todd already if you attended the League of Women Voters presentation he made a month or so ago. He also frequently speaks on Iowa Public Radio. We'll also learn about a really pivotal gun rights case currently before the US Supreme Court. The Wednesday after that, on June 8th, you'll become familiarized with how gun safety legislation has evolved at both the federal and state level, and the relationship between the degree of strictness in state gun laws and the level of gun deaths and violence in those states. And at that point, we can begin to ask what would constitute an effective public health approach to gun violence. And we hope that's a lively discussion. In the final session on June 15th, we'll bring the discussion home to Iowa, looking at what's happened legislatively in our state in recent years, and at the proposed constitutional amendment on the right to bear arms, which will be on the ballot in Iowa in November. We'll also take a look at some community strategies that Johnson County officials have been looking at to counteract gun violence. So that's what we hope to cover. And now I'm happy to turn this back over to Michelle and Trish.
Thank you. Thanks, Liz, for that, that introduction and helping us to set the stage for what we're all going to be learning over the next few weeks. Again, my name is Tricia Zebrowski. I'm very happy to be affiliated with Moms Demand Action and also with this course. Today's, our goal for today is to provide you with a foundational understanding of the numbers. What does gun violence look like in America today and in the state of Iowa? And so in order to do that, I'm going to be sharing lots of data and numbers with you. And I'll always try to sort of refocus us on what is the main takeaway or the main point of those numbers. The reason that we're doing this is because we think it's critical for people to understand why we are thinking about considering gun violence as a public health crisis in this country. So I'm going to start broadly, kind of at the top, and talk about what we know about gun production in the United States as of today. So these are numbers and the data that we're going to be sharing are from multiple sources. Much of the data comes from the CDC. Much of the data comes from peer-reviewed articles, published articles and papers. Much of the data that we're going to be talking about comes from Everytown Research, which is a treasure trove of information about gun ownership, gun violence in the United States. So let's just look at gun production. In the past 10 years or so, and the data that we have are between 2010 and 2020, the number of guns produced in the United States of America every year, doubled. In 2020, of the 11 million guns made in the United States alone, a full 6.5 million of those were handguns. So we can see that close to 50% of, or 50% of the guns that are manufactured in the United States of America as of 2020 were handguns. I think the fact that manufacturing of guns in general doubled every year in the United States, looking as far back as 2010, is something to note. So there are more guns being produced in the United States. Let's look at sales. People buy guns. In 2019, so we have data, we're only looking at data across the past 3 or 4 years or so. In 2019, there were 28 million guns sold in the United States of America. And if you think back to the slide I just showed you before, the overwhelming majority of those sales were handguns. In 2020, that number went up to 39 million, and in 2021, 38 million. What's important to note is that this number of gun sales in the United States is likely an undercount. And the reason that I'm saying that is because in our country, if you are an individual who buys multiple guns, then you are required to complete only one background check. So it's not one background check per gun purchase. There's virtually no documentation or extremely limited documentation on many private sales. That means individuals who own guns, who are selling them, not at gun shows, not in retail spaces, but are selling them to other people privately. And then there's a large problem, which we'll talk about at some point, in that there are many, many, many unaccounted for ghost guns in this country. And this has become a significant issue in the past couple of years in particular.
Tricia, could I just clarify one thing?
Please.
Guns sold at gun shows are not liable, are not subject to the background check rule too. So we don't know about those either. Correct.
And so that's pretty significant, or very significant. So let's compare these sort of overall statistics, overall numbers of gun sales and gun violence in the United States with what happens and has been happening in our own state of Iowa. In the United States, every year, there are approximately 40,000 gun deaths annually. That accounts for about 12 deaths per 100,000 people in the population. In addition to that, about 85,000 individuals in the United States are wounded by guns. So 40,000 people plus die as a result of guns, and 85,000 of those individuals are wounded as well. If you look to the state of Iowa, and again, we have to think proportionally here, there's an average of 302 deaths per year, and about 9.4 deaths out of 100,000 people in the state of Iowa. We rank, and we'll talk more about state rankings and as they relate to gun legislation per state a little bit later, at the end of the presentation. But right now in the United States of America, we rank 42nd. And can you say a little bit about this, Liz, this ranking, and what's the best way to interpret it?
Well, it's, I think the ranking is related to the second bullet point in each of those two columns. 12.2 deaths per 100,000 population, and compared to 9.4 deaths per 100,000 population is kind of an indication of the relative, the volume of deaths per state. So 42, that might be kind of reassuring, right? But the next slide indicates that there's there's trouble ahead, because the suicide rate in the United States, that there's been a 12% increase in the last 10 years. But in Iowa, there's been a 35% increase. And that's 3 times the rate of the US. And with respect to homicides, we have over twice as great an increase for the last 10 years. So I don't think we're going to hold on to our 42nd ranking for very long. We're going to be moving up the ladder. And that many people suggest that that's likely to happen because of the relaxation of gun laws in the state.
Right. So that's the point, is that 42nd ranking, 42nd may not look so bad, but I think it's going to change. Thanks, Liz. So let's look now at some more in let's unpack some of those numbers pertaining to gun deaths in the US and Iowa. In the US, as Liz just said, there's been an increase in suicide, a 12% increase in suicide in the past 10 years or so. If you look across to our state, though, in Iowa, there's been a much larger increase, a 35% increase in suicide completed by firearm between 2011 and 2020. So that's quite a significant increase, obviously. If you look down at the next point, there's been 70% increase in gun deaths in the United States in the same 9-year period. Look across to our state, and there's been an unbelievably high 168% increase in gun deaths in the state of Iowa in the past 9 years. That's quite remarkable, and in not a good way, obviously. If you look down to this last point, we see that more than 110 Americans every day are killed by gun in this country, and more than 200 Americans are shot and wounded every day. And so these statistics, both in and of themselves, and when you compare the United States to the state of Iowa, are chilling. Now, we can go further, and one of the reasons we want to do this and further in unpacking these numbers is because we're going to spend quite a bit of time talking about suicide by gun in the next few slides, because there are some chilling statistics that have that we've seen over the past 10 years in regard to this. So I want to talk a little bit more about how gun deaths can be broken out, not only in our country, but also in the state of Iowa. So if you look at the first bullet, in the US, a full 59% of gun deaths are suicides. Over half of all the gun deaths in the United States of America are suicides. 38%, going down to the next bullet point, are homicides. Shootings by police, 1% of the deaths in the United States, or 547 total annually, are shootings by police. And there's an asterisk here that relates to the footnote at the bottom, and I want to make sure I point that out. These data, the percentage of shootings, gun deaths that are by police, these data come from a project called Mapping Police Violence. And this is one of the many efforts by a consortium of media and nonprofit groups that track shootings by police. And this consortium believes that this actual figure, this 1%, can undercount by as much as half. And they estimate that 1,144 people in the US were killed by police in 2021, and that's 12 more than were killed in 2020. Black people are 2.9% or 2.9 times more likely than white people in the US to be killed by police. And the source of data for this statistic comes from the Department of Justice's Bureau of Justice Statistics. So that's an important note. And I think we also can assume that many of the statistics that we're going to be talking about today are likely to be undercounts of what's actually happening on the ground in the United States and Iowa as well. So let's talk a little bit more deeply about suicide by gun. Every year in the United States, 24,000 Americans successfully carry out suicide by firearm. And about a quarter of these people, a little less, 3,100 of these suicides are committed by young people between the ages of 10 and 24. We should also, years of age. We should also note that veterans are also a group of Americans who have a relatively high suicide by gun rate. And specifically, veterans are 1.5 times more likely to die by suicide than non-veterans. But keep this in mind, this top number. 24,000 Americans die of suicide every year, suicide successfully completed by gun. So we can look at that more closely. And what we know is that 6 out of 10 gun deaths, this is another way to think about these numbers. And to me, it's an easier way to hold these in my mind and actually consider the seriousness of this problem that we're having in the United States. 6 out of 10 gun deaths are suicides. In Iowa, this is close to 80% of all gun deaths. So 80% of gun deaths in the state of Iowa are suicides. 51% of all suicides in the United States involve a gun, and suicide by gun occurs once in every 22 minutes in the United States. One of the things that I think is very notable is that when you compare the United States to other high-income countries around the world, the suicide by gun rate in the United States is 12 times higher than that of these other high-income countries. Okay. And one of the things that has been noted more recently in the news, and we heard this in President Biden's address to the nation last night, I think it's reasonable to say that many of these other high-income countries have the same sorts of problems as the United States does in terms of mental health issues, socioeconomic challenges, and what is the thing that differentiates our suicide rate from those other countries is likely the easy availability of guns. And that's a controversial point, but I think the data are pointing in that direction. So let's move on and look in general. We talked about this a little bit, but this bears repeating, that the firearm suicide rate increased by 12% in the past 9 years. This is sort of, I'm repeating this because we talked about this earlier, but I think this is important to repeat. And in the United States alone, suicide among young people has increased by 53%. So let's compare that. In our country in general, overall suicide by firearm has increased by 12%, but the increase in suicide by gun among young people in our country has increased by 53%. That's a remarkable gap. So let's look at some of the specific demographics that we have about what types of individuals are successfully completing suicide by gun. 86% of successful firearm suicides are committed by men. And in particular, another way of thinking about it is that men are 7 times more likely than women to die by firearm suicide. So I want you to keep that number in mind in particular, because we're going to break that down in a little bit and talk about some reasons why that might be. And those reasons have to do with availability of guns and the relationship between gun availability and the likelihood for successful suicide. Those things are related. Suicide rates for men in the United States of America increase with age, and they're especially high for those men who are 55 years or older. And as we'll talk about later, it's important to recognize that this percentage intersects with availability of guns, and also, as we'll talk about later, where you live. Whether you live in an urban area or whether you live in a rural area. And we can all agree that Iowa is an agricultural state, primarily a rural state. So again, 86% of successful suicides committed by men. Men are 7 times more likely than females to die by firearm suicide, and suicide among men increases with age. The rate increases with age, and especially true for the senior citizen population, men who are 55 years of age or older. Again, how does this suicide rate intersect with gun availability? Well, we know from the data that men who own handguns are 8 times more likely to die of gun suicide. So we'll talk about this as well later, and that is that suicides carried out by other means besides guns, so let's say drugs, hanging, other kinds of methods for suicide, they tend to be much less successful than guns. Something like 94% of suicides attempted by gun are successful. So that intersects here. Men who own handguns are much more likely to die of suicide. Women's firearm suicide rates are also highest. They're lower than men's, as we talked about, but they also are highest in older women between 45 and 60 years of age. So regardless of whether you're male or female, and we only have data on males and females, women's firearm suicide rates and men's firearm suicide rates increase as we get older. As I said earlier, it's important, particularly for us to think about in the state of Iowa, that Americans who live in rural areas have far higher rates of firearm suicide than in urban areas. And those rates increase as counties become more rural. The firearm suicide rate in most rural counties, and this is in the United States in general, not specific to the state of Iowa, although we see the same trends, that in most rural counties, the firearm suicide rate is 2/5 times higher than in most urban counties.
Tricia, I think that's
Yes.
2.5 times. I think that's what.
Oh, you are. I'm sorry. I made an error on the slide. Yes, you are correct. Sorry about that. So 2.5 times higher, not 2/5. That makes no sense. Than in most urban counties. Thanks, Liz.
Mhm.
So at the end of these data that I just presented to you on suicide in the United States, maybe specific to Iowa as well, and some of the demographics, who are the people in our country who are the most likely to commit suicide by firearms, what are some of the things that we can conclude? Who is most at risk? I think what we can conclude is that men are, and particularly men who are older than 55, are more likely to commit suicide than women. Men who own handguns and men who own handguns who live in rural as opposed to urban areas. So those three things enter into these increasing rates of suicide by death. And so I think that puts certain population in the state of Iowa particularly at risk. Men who live in rural areas and are older than 55 and who possess handguns or guns in general. So let's think about how guns and ownership of guns, as opposed to people who are contemplating suicide and don't have access to firearms. What's the relationship there? And I talked about this a little bit later, a little bit earlier rather. And that is that most people who attempt suicide but do not use a gun are not successful. Most people who attempt suicide don't complete it, are not successful unless they use a gun. So this speaks to the importance of gun access, safe gun storage, and how we need to consider that as a very important point when we're talking about successful suicide by firearms. For all suicide attempts that do not involve a firearm, only 4% of those result in death. So only 4% of suicide attempts where a gun is not used are successful. For gun suicides, 90% of those attempts end in death. So the overwhelming majority of suicide attempts when a gun is involved are successful. If an individual has access to a gun in some way, and access to a gun does not need to mean that the person owns a gun, as we'll talk about a little bit later, but just knowing where they can get their hands on a gun, knowing a friend or family member who has a gun, knowing how to access that gun. So just because a gun is put away in a drawer or hidden does not mean that it is safely secured. So it doesn't mean that all or even most of successful gun suicides are by people who own guns, but just that they have access. So access to a gun in some way triples the risk of death by suicide, even, and I think this is particularly important to our conversation, even when you control for other factors such as poverty, unemployment, serious mental illness, and other factors. Very important point here that just having access to a gun alone, when you factor or account for other contributing factors for sure, just having access to a gun triples the risk of death by suicide. Very important to consider. And finally, the vast majority of survivors of suicide attempts do not go on to die by suicide. So it's specific to gun access. If you have access to a gun, you're more likely to be successful when you're attempting suicide than if you use other forms. Very important. So now we have to talk about gun violence and children. It's particularly salient on this very sad day as we are all reeling from the events of yesterday that occurred in Texas. And I think we should pause to consider this first point and what this means to us in our country. And it's something that we see all the time now, unfortunately. And it's one of our national tragedies, I think, is that right now, gun violence is the leading cause of death among children and teens in the United States. And just think about that. Gun violence is the leading cause of death among children and teens in the US. And as we'll see in the next slide, in the next couple of slides, this now has superseded deaths by things like automobile accidents, which for many, many years was the highest or the leading cause of death among children. Gun violence has now superseded that. An average of 3,500 children and teens die each year in our country due to gun violence. And let's break that down a little bit. 60% of gun deaths each year in the United States of America are homicides, with a full 85% of those occurring in the home, and a third related to in some way to domestic violence incidents occurring in the home, either individual incidents or sort of more globally, violence in the home. So 85% of these, of the 60% of gun deaths that children and young people are victims of every year are the result of homicides, or I'm sorry, are the result of gun access in the home in some way. 35% of gun deaths among children in our country occur are suicides. 4% are unintentional deaths, and 2% are somehow undetermined. So most of the gun deaths in our country suffered by children are suicides, but a full 35%. Are homicides, but a full 35% are suicides. 95% of gun deaths in our country suffered by children can be divided between homicide and suicide. And then we also have a large number of children, 15,000 children per year in the United States of America are shot and wounded in some way. So not killed, but are shot and wounded. So here's a graphic illustration of how gun death has become, or some of the numbers, and this gives you a visual understanding of how gun violence and particularly gun death has changed. Gun deaths have increased over the past 10 years or so, 20 years or so. So if you look on the vertical axis, this vertical axis is deaths per 100,000 children in the population, children and adolescents in our country. And if you look at the horizontal axis, this is years. So we start here, 1999, all the way to 2020. And what I want you to pay attention to is the blue line here and the yellow line. The blue line up top, these are motor vehicle crashes. So various motor vehicle accidents. The yellow line, if you can see my cursor on the yellow line here, the yellow line relates to firearm related injuries. So these are deaths.
It used to be really, really high.
Pardon? So if you look at, I'm sorry, I thought someone asked a question. So if you look here in 1999, the leading cause of death among children and adolescents in the United States was motor vehicle crash. And over the years, this has decreased. And you can think of the reasons why that might be. Gun safety measures, legislation, motor vehicle safety legislation, such as wearing seatbelts, better built cars, airbags and airbag requirements in cars, seatbelt laws, those sorts of things. People, the general population becoming more conscientious about safety in cars. That's decreased over the years. And the yellow line is firearm related injuries. So here we have 1999, and you can see how things were relatively stable over the years. And then starting in around 2016, gun deaths, firearm related injuries among children increased. And here we are in 2019, and now we see the crossover. So in 2020, and this most likely has continued to increase. In 2020, we see a crossover where firearm-related deaths and injuries are the most prevalent cause of death in the United States, and motor vehicle crashes became less frequent.
May I just add something,
You
Tricia?
may, of course.
Yeah, we thought that this was a particularly interesting slide because it relates to what Nicholas Kristof is talking about in the op-ed piece that Michelle emailed to all of our participants. He says we should do with the gun violence crisis what we did with motor vehicle deaths, and treating it as a public health crisis. And he relates, since World War II, the number of motor vehicle deaths on the highways has dropped precipitously for exactly the factors that Tricia mentioned. And you can see that's an astounding drop there. And he's saying we can, if we put our minds to it, we can develop strategies to accomplish the same kind of thing with gun violence.
Yes. I mean, that's one of the reasons why, or the main reason that we included this slide, is because it's such a sort of startling visual representation of how things have changed in both a very good way in terms of motor vehicle crash and motor vehicle safety, and a very tragic way in terms of guns and gun violence. And again, as Liz mentioned, we hope that you had a chance to read Nick Kristof's New York Times op-ed that was sent out to you. But also, you may have noted that it was republished either yesterday or today in the New York Times. So if you didn't get the link, or you can't access the link that was sent out, if you look in yesterday or today's New York Times, you will see that the 2017, I think it was, our op-ed has been republished by the New York Times. Okay, so let's look even more specifically at children and guns in the home, because if, as you recall in one of the previous slides, talked about 80 to 85% of gun deaths or homicides in children in our country occur in the home. So what are some reasons why that might be? Well, about 4.6 million children in the United States live in a household with at least one gun that is loaded and not safely locked away. And so that, I think, is one of the most important considerations right now. And so this, you can go back to the earlier slides where we talked about gun production and gun sales. So there are more guns being produced in the country, and there are more guns being sold in the country right now than ever before. And that both of those numbers have doubled. And right now, there's about 4.6 million children. It's probably an undercount, as most of these numbers are, in the United States that live in a household where there is a gun, at least one, and this gun is loaded and it is not safely locked away. Most children who die as a result of gun suicide use a firearm that they access in their homes. So these homes where there are guns that are loaded and not safely locked away, children most likely have access to them and use those as in attempts, and mostly successful, to commit suicide.
Could I add a kind of an interesting point?
Yes,
Tricia?
please do.
Yeah, that 4.6 million figure has not changed. I read about an updated study of children and guns in the home, which said that, it was 4.6 million a few years ago. It's 4.6 million today. Even though the education of families about the importance of gun storage has led to an improved situation for those families who take it seriously and lock their guns away, keep them out of reach of kids or anybody. There are more households now with loaded and unlocked guns. Loaded and unlocked guns. So the 4.6 million has remained stable, you know, so we have to just work harder on the gun storage education process.
Right. So the fact that the number hasn't changed, we can account for it by the fact that more guns are available. And so that's can wash out the success of parent education movements in some way, sort of washes it out. So the number doesn't change very much or hasn't changed. Thanks, Liz. Most children who die by suicide with by gun get the gun somewhere in their home. I said that before. And this third bullet is another thing that is essential to consider, and that is that children who live in cities and are living in poverty or at the poverty level, are low income youth, are much more likely to witness gun violence than suburban or middle income youth. And so here we can speak to, and we're not going to get into that today, but the significant trauma that children witness when they experience, or that children experience rather, when they witness any form of gun violence. And that's a whole other topic that bears serious discussion and consideration. So not just firearm injury or death, but the trauma that survivors of gun violence, and in particular children, suffer, and that impacts them negatively for their entire lives, if not addressed. In 2021, here I am at the last bullet point here, there were 392 incidents of unintentional shootings by children between January and March, just in this year alone. There were 77 incidents resulting in 31 deaths and 50 injuries. So with the increase in gun ownership, gun production and gun ownership, and these high numbers of children being affected by guns when they have access to guns in their homes. There are children who are getting their hands on guns and are committing unintentional shootings as well. And this number was 77 of these incidents in 3 months alone, between January and March of 2022. So that's the picture, the general picture of guns, gun violence among children, and how guns in the home relates to those issues. Now let's talk a little bit about intimate partner violence, which also is sort of intersects with gun violence in general in the home and how this impacts children. Nearly 1 million women alive today in the United States of America have been shot or shot at by an intimate partner. Let me say that again. It's very important that we think about this. Nearly 1 million women, and again, this is likely an undercount, alive today have been shot or shot at by an intimate partner. And just as access to a gun relates highly to suicide by gun, to witnessing gun violence, to being a victim or a survivor of gun violence, access to a gun in a domestic violence situation makes it 5 times more likely that a woman will be killed. So nearly 1 million women alive today have been affected, have been shot or shot at, and access to a gun in domestic violence situation makes it 5 times more likely that a woman will be killed in our country. And there's a disproportionate impact on racial minorities when we're thinking about intimate partner violence. So let's break that down a little bit. Between 2018 and 2019, okay, we think about the number of individuals per million in the population that were experienced intimate partner violence. You can see that for the most part, Black individuals are much more likely, we're much more likely to experience some form of gun violence than Asian Americans, with Native Americans and Latino, white and American Asian down here following. So there's a disproportionate impact on racial minorities in this country when a gun is available or there's access to a gun and there's intimate partner violence. Every month, an average of 70 women in this country are shot and killed by an intimate partner. Let me say that again. Every month, an average of 70 women are shot and killed by an intimate partner in this country. And women of color are much more likely to be a victim of intimate partner violence. So one of the things we wanted to think about as we sort of end up this presentation of numbers and data and facts is how much the pandemic has impacted or led to or fueled or influenced gun violence in our country. And we don't really have conclusive evidence on this. There's been some isolated studies that have looked at this, and we can assume, I think this is an accurate, appropriate assumption, that there's going to be a lot more research coming out in the next year, in the next few years, looking specifically at how the pandemic, when you factor out all of the confounding factors, how the pandemic alone has impacted gun violence in our country. One of the things that we can speculate, and I think the data supports this prediction, is that there has been an astronomical increase in gun sales in this country during the pandemic. We can also think about the high degree of stress and documented stress that's occurred during the pandemic as the result of a pandemic that most likely has led to increases in gun violence. So we think about things like losing your job, isolation at home with your family, if you or your family members contracted COVID, all of the things that led to high degrees of stress during the pandemic, and I've listed some of these, most likely will show that they contribute to increases of gun violence in the country. Lots of data coming out now that show not only increases in domestic violence during the pandemic, but that these instances of domestic violence included a gun. So we want you to think about what other pandemic-related situations may have led to increases in gun violence in this country. And I think there's lots more that we'll find out about this in the days and weeks, years to come. So we can't talk about gun violence in our country without talking about mass shootings. We've seen far too many of those in recent days, over the past few years, even up to, as we talked about earlier, yesterday, in the tragedy in Texas. So the operational definition of mass shooting is 4 or more people shot and killed at one time, excluding the shooter. That is one definition of a mass shooting. And as we have seen, unfortunately, in our country, most of the mass shootings that have occurred, let's say across the past 2 years, have included more than 4 individuals, but the 4 is the least. Between 2009 and 2019, so in 10 years, 390,000 people, more than that, 390,293 deaths in this country have occurred from all types of gun violence. And in that same period, 1,363 firearm deaths have occurred from mass shootings. So of all the deaths from all types of gun violence in the past 10 years, 1,363 of these deaths were the result of mass shootings or occurred in mass shootings. 61% of mass shootings occurred entirely within private homes. So let's think about that a little bit. 61% of all the mass shootings across a 10-year period of time occurred entirely within private homes, where someone with a gun went into a home and shot multiple individuals in the home. That is most likely related to domestic violence and these mass shootings. So 61% of these mass shootings in homes are most likely intermingled with acts of domestic partner violence. So you see that lots of what we're talking about in regard to mass shootings has some form of domestic violence that with which it intersects. And then we need to talk about mass shootings in schools. In the past, in 6-year period, a 6-year period of time between 2013 and 2019, an estimated 549 instances of gunfire occurred on school grounds. So that's in the period between 2013 and 2019. And so I want you to think about or recognize the fact that there have been school shootings that have occurred between 2019 and where we are today. And so this number is likely to be quite a bit high. It is higher and likely to be quite a bit higher today. More instances of gunfire than 549 occurred on school grounds. And of those shootings between 2013 and 2019, there were 129 deaths and 270 individuals were wounded. And that's higher, right? Because we're only thinking this number only applies to the years between 2013 and 2019. So these mass shootings in schools also include homicide, obviously homicide, but also suicide and unintentional shootings. So some of these unintentional shootings, children who come to school with guns and don't really intend to use them in any sort of mass shooting incident, but bring them to school loaded, and there is an unintentional shooting. Where racial demographic data are available, and they're not available, these data are not available in all the studies that we've used for this presentation. But where racial data are available, we see that 2/3 of these shooting incidents in schools occur in majority minority schools. So it's another example of how racial demographics suggest or indicate that gun availability, gun access, gun violence disproportionately impacts people of color in our country. So we're going to talk now about some legislative issues, okay? And this is where the rest of this course, to a large degree, is going to lead us. Is there any relationship between gun laws and gun violence? And a lot of the data that we're going to be speaking about here comes from Everytown research. And everytown.org, Liz talked a little bit about it, the Everytown organization, has done extensive research on state-by-state level, not only on gun violence incidents, but also on gun legislation and gun laws, and the relationship between gun legislation, gun laws, and gun violence in our country. So Everytown and their research organization compared gun policy across the country, state by state, scoring every state on the strength of its gun laws, looking at 50 key policies. And if you're interested in really getting down in the weeds, we encourage you to get on everytown.org, the website, and look at their research arm, and you can find out everything you wanted to know pretty much on every gun law by state and the relationship by, or the rankings of every state by their gun laws. In states, and this is the takeaway point here, in states, according to Everytown, where elected officials have taken action to pass gun safety laws, fewer people die by gun violence. And you don't have to take our word for it. You can go in and do the research yourself, and you'll see. And not just in Everytown, which has an exhaustive research data, but in other sources where elected officials have taken action to pass gun safety laws, fewer people die by gun violence. And so this is a graph that was put together by Everytown based on what I just talked about, their rankings. They looked at every state and the gun laws, the ranking of their gun laws, the strength of their gun laws, and the rate of gun violence. And so as you look here, you see, I want you to just pay attention. Let's just pay attention right now here. You see in blue, the strength of the gun law, okay? And in red, the gun violence rate. So the longer the line, the longer the blue line, and this shows you, the relationship, but the longer the blue line, the stronger the gun law, and the longer the red line, the higher the gun death rate. So you see, California is number one in the strength of its gun laws and the low gun violence rate. So the national leaders are California, and in the top 8, we see New Jersey. Relatively strong gun law strength, relatively strong gun laws, and relatively small gun violence rate. This next cluster, these are the states that are making progress. So we see the state of Washington up top, all the way to Minnesota. So the national leaders include from 1 to 17, go from California all the way to Minnesota at number 17. So here you see, for example, in Minnesota, the gun laws are relatively strong and the gun violence rate about the same in terms of strength. Okay. Now, states that are missing what Everytown considers to be key laws, and those key laws might include things like requiring permits, requiring specific types of background checks, things like stand your ground laws. And so missing key laws, here you see the relationships between, and the proportions start to change here. So let's look at Nevada, for example. You can see that proportionally, the strength of the gun laws in the state, relatively weak, yet the rate of gun violence relatively high. And so you should expect to see, and we do actually, as you go down, that as I said up top, that the weaker the gun laws, the higher the rate of gun violence. And so now these, according to Everytown, are the weak systems and the national failures. So let's look at where we are, right here, Iowa, number 33. I'm circling it with the cursor. I'm hoping you can see that. And you look here and you see Iowa, and this is what is our current situation, although most likely this is different now because these data are probably a few years old, probably ending in 2019 or 2020. And what you see is that Iowa has relatively weak gun laws and proportionally relatively high gun violence rate. Okay. Some of the failures, you go down to the lowest ranked state, and this is been in the news a lot lately, state of Mississippi. Look at right here. Very, very, very almost shockingly weak gun laws. And look here at the rate of gun violence. So we can see when we look at these rankings, go back to the first one, that the stronger the gun laws in a particular state, the lower the rate of gun violence, all the way till we get to the weak systems and the national failures. I think these data are very compelling and tell the story. And let me go back before I end to the slide that started this whole section, to this main takeaway point, which I think what we've talked about so far, the data I've presented you so far have shown, and the rankings by state lead us to conclude that where elected officials take action to pass sensible gun safety laws, fewer people die by gun violence. Okay, and so now what I want you to see before we have a discussion or respond to some of your questions, that when you get the handout, which should be available to you, we've included the sources, some of the sources, the most important sources that we used to put together this presentation.